Hi, it's Stefan here in downtown Sofia. Today I'll take you on a virtual tour along one of the most historic streets in our capital, Moskovska Street. Probably you'll be amazed to hear and to see that in Sofia we have so many streets dedicated to the Russians and so many monuments dedicated to them. And the reason for that is the fact that we have had a special relationship with this country over the centuries. The Russians helped us for the liberation from the Ottoman Empire in the 1878. And exactly on this street, Moskovska Street, in the very same year, they were welcomed by the local population. And according to Bulgarians, the term that was used, it was Moskovci, or people from Moscow, actually emphasizing on the historic status of Moscow, the capital of the Russian state, for a really significant time. So right now I am in the back garden of the former royal palace of Bulgaria. Naturally, the palace situated in the very heart of the city. Actually, when Bulgaria was liberated 1 year later, in 1879, Sofia was chosen to become the capital of the state. And it became a capital, but there was no palace. So the most impressive, the largest building here was a Turkish administrative building. And this Turkish administrative building was chosen to become a home for the Bulgarian kings. The royal palace itself was renovated by architects from Austria, architects Rumpelmayer and Grunanger, and this is the reason why that today you can see a building which is built in the style of the Austrian palaces with connection to the French historic palaces of the 1700s. Yellow as the traditional color of the royal family of Bulgaria, and this is the reason why when you walk around Sofia you'll be able to see that there are many buildings in this color. So here it was the royal palace, but how is that possible that I'm walking within the grounds of the palace? There used to be a wall with cast iron here, but in 1946, already with the presence of the communists, there was a referendum. A simple question: monarchy or a republic? And overwhelmingly, people presumably chose republic. This is the reason why the royal family was expelled from Bulgaria, and in order to show this physically, the new authorities tore down this wall, and the royal palace itself became a building for the Bulgarian Fine Arts Gallery, the National Fine Arts Gallery, and the National Ethnographic Museum. So what you can see in front of you is the parking lot in front of one of the entrances of the former party house. This party house of the communist authorities was built in the mid-1950s. Here it was the powerhouse of the People's Republic of Bulgaria. But years and years before the communists, here it was the beating heart of Bulgaria, because it was the commercial center of the capital. Targovska Street, numerous beautiful buildings, mostly built in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Actually, they were damaged in World War II by the Allied bombings. A few years later, the communists took advantage of this fact. They completely revamped the city center of Sofia. So here it is where Moskovska Street starts. Right behind me is the entrance of the former party house of Bulgaria, which today is used as the seat of the national parliament. But 20th century ago, on the place of this building, you can see some Roman buildings. Right behind this building were one of the main gates of the Roman city of Serdica. And the place where I'm standing right now, you would be here if you wanted to go to one of the future powerhouses in world history, to Constantinople or later Istanbul, because here it was the road leading to this great city, part of the very famous Via Diagonalis, one of the most prominent Roman roads. We are in the back of the royal palace. Remember when I told you that this garden was surrounded by walls that were taken away in the 1940s. Today this place is used by the National Fine Arts Gallery of Bulgaria, and this is the reason why you can see different monuments around. But also here it is used as a place for recreation. A lot of benches where people could have some time off, and when the regulations regarding the pandemic are over, this is one of the good places where you can have a good refreshing cocktail in the summer, right in the heart of the winter's garden of the Royal Palace of Bulgaria. You can see this beautiful new classical building. This building was built in the 1880s on the place of an old Turkish inn. The idea for this building was to host one of the first high schools in Sofia. You can see some of the signs of the new classical style, like the triangular gables on the top of the building. Once the building was built, there were some ideas to use it as a pub, but well, it's just a few meters away from the royal palace, so the king was not happy, and this is the reason why permission was not granted. So then they came with the idea, why not turning it into a school? And this is how it became one of the first high schools in Bulgaria. Throughout the years, it hosted the classes of Sofia University, the liberal arts schools of the university, and today is the home to some of the institutes of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. We are in front of the next building along Moskovska Street. In the recent years, it has always been a restaurant, famous restaurant in Sofia, Bulgaria, but initially, when it was built in the 1880s, it was used for residential purposes. Then it became the first military club in Bulgaria. Why is that so? Remember when I was talking about the other building over there, which was used as a school? There, it was situated one of the barracks for the Russian military personnel stationed in Sofia, Bulgaria, in the late 1870s, early 1880s. So naturally, this place was chosen to be the heart of their social life. Drama plays, small concerts would take place. This was even the first place in Sofia where there was draft beer from the tap. Well, throughout the years, it served as a parliament in the 1880s when the building of the parliament burned and a new one had to be built. It was also used as a place for different social events, practically till the early 1900s. So from then on, it became a military museum. There were cannons in the yard of the church, and till 1937 it was used for that. But not only this, actually, this place was once again used as a home for 4 years between 1937 and 1941, when an Italian princess, Catherine of Parma, lived here as a specially invited guest by the royal couple of Bulgaria, King Boris III and his wife Giovanna of Savoy. Then it was nationalized, expropriated by the communists, and from the 1990s it served as a restaurant. Sofia is a city full of history, and especially Moskovska Street is like an open-air museum. The house that you can see behind me was the house of one well-educated Bulgarian, the first chairman of the Bulgarian Supreme Court, the first Minister of Justice in Bulgaria, Grekov. Dimitar Grekov was his name. Initially, it was only one-story building built in the late 1800s, and later it was added a new floor and then an attic floor. You can see the differences in the architectural styles at the back, the new classical style and at the ground level, and then we have some elements, especially in the attic level, that are already showing the first signs of the Art Nouveau architectural style in Bulgaria. One of the most impressive buildings in Sofia, the building of the former Sofia Bank, is situated also on Moskovska Street. This is the green building with a dome on the top that you can see, and it was used also as a home for the Bulgarian National Radio in the 1930s. But today it is also a bank. Initially, it was designed to host the apartment of the general director of the bank and not only used for administrative purposes. The decoration of the bank is really impressive. On the top of the corner, under the dome, we have the representation of the Roman god Mercury as a symbol of trade and banking. Also, we have images of eagles and heads of Medusas with the simple idea to protect the bank, the investors, and the money inside. This is the reason why when you walk around from the two sides of the bank, along Moskovska Street and along Bankovsky Street, these characteristical elements will be all around Sofia Bank. Situated right across the building of Sofia Bank that we have just been talking about, there's one building, yellow building, in a new classical style. The building was built here in the 1890s, and later it was reconstructed. A couple more floors were added, and it was purchased by an interesting man, Shevkov. He was a trader, he was a merchant, and he was a Bulgarian born in the town of Prilep in present-day Macedonia. In the 1860s, he went to Suez when the canal was being built, and together with his brothers, he was selling lemonade, syrup, and other refreshing drinks. And when they were there, they noticed that the skin of the oxes and the buffaloes were thrown away, and they were practically wasted. So they decided, why not add some salt, and then they might send them back to the Balkans where they can be used as a material for cervuli, a special type of shoes that is made of the skin of animals. So they started a really good business, especially in the town of Thessaloniki in present-day northern Greece, and then they had to move. They came to Sofia in 1912 and they moved into this building. Well, slowly the business was dying out till the 1920s, where the main material was not skins anymore. It was rubber. Yeah, it is not only about historic buildings and architecture. The building that you can see behind me, built initially as part of the royal complex, today is covered with street art, with public art. And as you can see, this is not Bulgarian language. Actually, it is Dutch. There was an initiative in 2007 when Bulgaria became a member of the European Union to emphasize on the unity of the peoples of Europe through literature and especially through poetry. And this is the reason why some of the walls in Sofia are covered with such graffiti, with such street art. And in our case here, as I mentioned, it is the beginning of this. So Dutch, and so I believe that also you are. This is the Dutch entry. Quite close to the royal palace, it was situated one of the first diplomatic agents in Sofia, and this was the Russian embassy. Actually, the building that you can see in front of me was used as an embassy till the 1970s, when a new complex for the Russian embassy was built. Here, this embassy today is a cultural center and also a good Armenian restaurant. Practically, if you were 100 years ago, it won't be possible to walk around because it was the complex within the embassy, protected by a solid wall, and also in the complex a church was built, the Russian Church of Sofia. That's the church that you can see in the far end of the garden over there. The church was opened for worship in 1913, and ever since it was used by the Russian citizens living in Sofia, Bulgaria. The beautiful yellow building across the street is one of the first cooperative buildings in Sofia, St Sophia cooperative building, designed by architect Lazar Parashkevanov. This building was a real miracle. First of all, it was situated on a prime location in Sofia. It was quite expensive, but the architect and his partner managed to get the money for the purchase of the land. Later, around 40 people gathered together, invested their money together to have this 8-story building. But there was a problem. It was situated right next to the main cathedral of Sofia, St Alexander Nevsky Cathedral. So the church was not happy with the fact that there was a building higher than the cathedral. The neighbors were not happy either. First, they were afraid that the building would collapse and destroy their homes. Then they complained that there'll be a lot of shade thrown on their property. Anyway, the construction began. 1928, there was a big earthquake in Bulgaria, in central Bulgaria, Chirpan earthquake. The building was intact, but the materials became more expensive. The investors, they didn't want to give more money, so this is the reason why architect Parashkevanov invested money to finish the construction. This was one of the first buildings with concrete in Sofia, and definitely the first building with anti-seismic construction. Here you can see the dynamic architecture of the building. Remember when I told you that some of the neighbors of the building of St Sophia were scared that the high rising building would collapse on their homes? One of them was practically living next door. A rich merchant named Stefan lived here. He was from a rich family from the town of Sliven, especially involved in the textile industry, and naturally, being rich, they wanted to show this through their home. So they finished the home in the early 1920s. The architect was one of the famous architects in Sofia, architect Nikola Wazarov, one of the most famous names in the architecture of eclectic and Art Nouveau style. So particularly interesting is the cornice level, where you can see the floral wreaths and the floral ornaments, which give an idea about the beauty of this home. Especially representative is the corner level of the house of Stefanov. You can see the balconies. You can see on the very top that there is a plastic representation of 1921, the year when it was built. And also of particular interest is the entrance of this building, which has cast iron as part of the decoration over there. One of the exceptions along Moskovska Street of this beautiful and elegant architecture of the early 1900s is the building behind me, which building was built in 1940s. So here you can see some of the elements of the modernist architecture, when we have the stern facade and we have the victory of functionality over aesthetics. Or said in other words, simply different aesthetics. The building was initially built to be a home of the royal estate. Here it was situated the administration of the royal palace, which took care of the properties of the palace both in Sofia, the capital, and in the countryside. Well, when the communists took power in the 1940s, they took over this building, and here it was situated the headquarters of the Fatherland's Front, one of the organizations of parties against the monarchy regime led by the communists. Here also in 1956 it took place one of the most famous plenums of the Bulgarian Communist Party, the April plenum, where 3 years after the death of Comrade Stalin, the Bulgarian communists said, "We simply didn't know what he was doing. That's why we are starting a new path for communism with a human face." Today, this building is a home to the mayor of Sofia and the city council. Also on Moskovska Street, it is situated one of the most emotional monuments in Sofia, the monument dedicated to the salvation of Bulgarian Jewish people during the Holocaust. Bulgarians managed to save their 49,000 people during the Holocaust, which was an effort of a nation supported by its political leaders, by the church, and of course by the royal family. And today, still on, this is remembered as one of the most noble deeds of the Bulgarian community during the dark hours of the Nazi regime and Nazi rule. Actually, it is built next to one of the oldest cathedrals, Christian cathedrals in Sofia, the Cathedral of St Sophia, which gave the name of our capital in late 1300s. And still there are people coming here to commemorate all those whose lives were lost in those periods, and especially to say that we remember, we are not going to forget. It's 1930s and the face of Moskovska Street is changing. Some of the one family houses are already gone and they open places for new cooperative buildings. Remember St Sophia cooperative building. But behind me there's another cooperative building built in the second half of the 1930s, and actually this time it was designed by a woman. Finally, in this male's job, we had a woman. Architect Victoria Angelova Vinarova designed this building here in the spirit of modernist architecture. Actually, she also designed different public buildings and private buildings as well. She was the first woman to win an architectural competition in Bulgaria, Architect Vinarova. On this corner of Moskovska Street, you find the house of one of the most famous Bulgarians who lived in the first half of 20th century. This was the home of Atanas Burov. He was a banker and a politician. Actually, his home here represents the mix of architectural styles. We have the functionality of the modernist style, but at the same time we have some elements of more emotional Art Nouveau. These are the cornice, the mansard, attic floor, and a couple of medallions symbolizing St. George. This was a home of a really interesting person. Atanas Burov, as I mentioned, was a banker and a politician. He's been our foreign minister in the 1930s, spoke fluently a number of languages. He was also one of the founders and large shareholders in some of the largest Bulgarian companies. These are Bulgarian Insurance Company, these are the Bulgarian Commercial Bank, etc., etc. But for 1 week in 1944, he was a minister again. He was a minister in the government of Konstantin Muraviev. That was between 2nd and 9th of September 1944. This was the time when Bulgaria was desperately trying to change the site in World War II because we were allies of Nazi Germany. And the government was desperately trying to prevent the advance of the Red Army and having Soviet troops in Bulgarian lands. Well, this didn't result it good because on September 9th, 1944, the Red Army invaded Bulgaria. Almost immediately, a special jurisdiction was established. This was the so-called People's Court, which initial goal was to put on trial all those members of the political class of Bulgaria who helped Bulgaria to take part in World War II on the side of Germany. Well, this was actually not the case. This was more or less a way of the communists to get rid of their political enemies. This is the reason why on February the 1st, 1945, the first cascade of verdicts came. The political elite of Bulgaria was decapitated. Regents, prime ministers, ministers, MPs, many of them were sentenced to death and killed on the next day. Atanas Burov was not killed. He was sentenced to imprisonment. Then he was released earlier to take part in the elections in late 1945, but later he was forcibly settled in the countryside, and finally he was sent to prison in Pazardzhik. When he passed away in the early 1950s, his wife Smaragda and his daughter went to pay respects to the body of their beloved Atanas. Somehow they found out where he was buried. They put a cross with his name and flowers. It was in the end of the Armenian cemetery in Pazardzhik. And when they returned on the next day to say a final farewell to Atanas Burov, already the ground was flattened and the soil was stomped, trying to eradicate the memory of a bygone era. In this part of Moskovska Street, next to the home of Burov, are situated the homes of other prominent Bulgarian families. Some of the homes that we are referring to are of the brothers Envogi and Evstrati Geshov, who were sons of one of the richest Bulgarian, Ivan Evstratiev Geshov. This is the home with the metal sculpture on the top of it. Then here comes the home of the sister of Nikola Mushanov. That's the one at the corner here, which today it is used as by one of the institutes of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Then we have something strange. We had the home of one of the most modest Bulgarian politicians, Nikola Mushanov. Unfortunately, his beautiful home was torn down in 2005, and they built this glass office building. Well, the initial idea was to have a boutique hotel. They rebuilt the facade of the building, which unfortunately is just a far cry of the original building. But what is in common of all these buildings along Moskovska Street? All of the buildings here, they were expropriated by the communists in the 1950s. They became public property. They were given to different institutions. Some of them were used as homes of loyal allies of the communist regime, of Soviet military attaches, etc., etc. Those were the homes of the former people. This term is used for all the people that were important during the time of the monarchy in Bulgaria, but later, during the communist period, they were sentenced by the so-called People's Court and prosecuted in various ways. It's already in the 1990s, and the communist regime is gone. So in the early 1990s, the private property is restored to a significant amount, and all of those buildings were given back to the owners, their heirs, or if it was not possible, they were compensated for that. Today, in this part of Moskovska Street, There are almost no residential buildings. Most of them are used by different institutions, especially institutes of Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, Sofia municipality, and also some private office buildings. In the very end of Moskovska Street is situated the Botanical Garden of Sofia University, designed by one Swiss, Neff, who was practically the father of the gardens and public parks in Sofia in the second half of the 1800s. This is still today used as a botanic garden. And here it ends the walk on Moskovska Street. This is the monument of Vasil Levski, Bulgarian national hero who lived in the 1800s. He was Bulgarian revolutionary, organized a net of secret committees which main goal was to organize a revolution against the Ottomans. In early 1870s, he was captured by the Ottomans, put on a trial, and sentenced to death. Here, he was executed. The man was executed, but the dream was alive. Just a few years later, Bulgaria was liberated, and in the 1890s, a monument to commemorate this great son of Bulgaria was built. Today in the heart of Sofia, but a century ago in the outskirts of the Bulgarian capital, the monument of Vasil Levski.